Hi there! Welcome to Pallet University and a really fun, interesting, potentially start of a new series on the channel. So, this program is not open because I do art. I'm very bad at art. Do not, please never ask me to do art. This is instead open because it's sort of the best way that I could think of to sort of point out different things on an image to you guys. So, little background. You might have seen on the sort of Pokemon corner of the internet some pictures or pieces of art of like Pokemon in real life by an artist named Joshua Dunlop. I know I have, and I've been very, very impressed because they look like how I envision Pokemon in my mind and like how I would imagine them from like a practicing biologist perspective. You know, they're not just the exact cartoon slapped onto like a realistic background or something. They're, biologically how I imagine Pokemon would look like. So I decided to take a crack at sort of explaining some of these things to you. I reached out to the artist and got his permission to make this series. And so we're going to be going through and talking about some of these pieces of art and some of the biological decisions that the artist made. So obviously, big thank you to the artist Joshua Dunlop. All of his social media stuff will be down below. His Twitter, Instagram, as well as the website where you can see all of these different pieces of art. There are 119 individual Pokemon that he's done, but he also does pieces of art from he's got some pieces from like Mario, some lots of dinosaur art as well. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe I saw on Twitter a while ago that he was involved in the development of a dinosaur based video game, which I think is super, super awesome. So I'm going to be going through and opening up some of these in this image editing software that I use to make my thumbnails and pointing out different biological things to you guys. So please do me a giant favor and check out all of Joshua's things down below. If you guys want, this could be a multi-part series. Like I said, there are so far 119 individual Pokemon that he's done. Obviously, I'm not going to get to all of them today. So there's going to be a lot that I'm not going to be able to cover today, so we can potentially turn those into future series if you all like the way this is presented. So let me know that down below as well. So with that, I guess let's just get started. Alright, so I'm not going to do all of the starters in this particular video, but I am going to start with Bulbasaur because I like some of the design choices that he chose for it. So Bulbasaur, pretty clearly in my opinion, has always been based off of a group of not direct ancestors to mammals, but in the same group called synapsids. In particular, a group of synapsids called Dicynodonts. They basically are these relatively small. They could have been anywhere from like only a foot long to I think potentially up to like pretty decent sized, roughly the size of like a pretty large dog, or potentially bigger. I'm not incredibly familiar with the group, but they had a beak as well as some little tusks. The tusks were used to dig up roots, and then the beak was used to sort of chop them up as they ate, and that's mostly what they ate was plant material. So that's always what I kind of thought Bulbasaur was based off of. So a thing that I'm going to be talking about quite a lot with some of these pieces of art are some of the creative liberties that the artist has taken in differentiating from the actual Pokemon itself. And one of the ones that he takes here with Bulbasaur are the ears. So if you'll notice on a Bulbasaur's sprite, Bulbasaur's 3D model, those aren't actual ears. There's no opening to them. They just sort of look like little bumps. But obviously Joshua thought that was not the case. And he decided to turn them into external pinnae, which is the technical scientific term for like the cartilaginous flexible part of your ear that's outside of your body. And it's very notable that only mammals have these. No other group of animals has these, not reptiles, birds, nobody else has them. Which to me points that Joshua agrees that these are based off of at least some type of synapsid. We don't really have a ton of evidence that non-mammalian synapsids had external pinnae, but I've seen evidence sort of for and against it, so it's kind of up in the air. but it's just one interesting choice that I thought he made, as well as also pretty clearly giving it these scales on the legs. And actually the legs to me look a lot like tortoise legs, just because tortoises tend to have pretty large scales on their legs, as well as forelimbs that sort of face in toward each other like that. You know, it's kind of hard to tell like the living posture of some extinct animals, but I don't know for sure. Like I said, I'm not an expert in this particular group of animals, so I don't know whether they held their legs in the same posture. But it sort of, like I said, to me, sort of looks like at least the front legs were inspired by tortoise forelimbs. But overall, I think this obviously looks incredibly good. The background also looks incredible with lots of, it looks like it's got a lot of plants that you would see in the forests of when like Dicynodonts were around, because plants with flowers hadn't really evolved yet when they were sort of relevant and, you know, pretty common. So they'd have, the only plants that were really around were things like ferns, mosses, and different kinds of trees that are technically still around, but not nearly as common. You know, lots of very early palm and pine type trees, which you can see lots of in the background. Alright, so that's Bulbasaur. So moving on to Ivysaur. The first thing that I notice when I look at this piece of art of Ivysaur is how many more leaves it has. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 leaves on its back, and presumably quite a few more on the backside that we can't see. But I know normally Ivysaur, I think, only has 4. You know, the 1 in the front, 2 on the sides, and then 1 in the back. So it's just another interesting, you know, creative choice that the artist made. If you can tell, this isn't scripted. I also like how he sort of toned down the scalation on the forelimbs. This one does. I can definitely see how you could possibly think that this might be some kind of amphibian. Amphibians also don't have claws, though. Fun fact. Some spadefoot toads have. It's not a claw. It's just a lot of keratin around their digits, particularly their back feet. But they're not claws. There's just like really, really hard skin. And there is a difference between claws and just super keratinized skin. So yeah. So that is another reason why I've never thought that the Bulbasaur line were based on frogs, is because they clearly have claws. On this one, you can very clearly tell the teeth are more pronounced than they were on Bulbasaur. Which sort of also, you know, it looks like it's got a little less of a beak than Bulbasaur did. But the teeth, sort of as the tusks of the Dicynodont, sort of inspiration is a lot more evident in Ivysaur, I think. And I don't know for sure whether the teeth are actually bigger, like proportionately, on like the official art or any of the 3D models of Bulbasaur and Ivysaur. I'm not really sure. But that's pretty much all I noticed about Ivysaur, is just sort of, like I said, the reduced scalation and the extra leaves. So let's now take a look at Venusor, because Venusor looks super cool. Once again, one of the first things that I noticed is that Venusor also has some extra leaves. It looks like it's got 2 over here, the one on the front, and then at least 3 or 4 over on this side. And I believe Venusor also typically only has the 1 leaf in the front, the 1 in the back, and then the 2, you know, 1 on each side. It also looks like Venusor is a lot more upright with its legs sort of underneath it, as opposed to them being out to the side, which is also pretty indicative of being mammal adjacent. Most reptiles don't typically have their limbs underneath their body. They typically have them out to the sides. You know, there are some exceptions, like dinosaurs in particular were one of the main exceptions to that rule for reptiles. But that, to me, also sort of indicates, once again, that these were based off of mammal cousins, as opposed to toads or some other kind of non-mammal adjacent vertebrate. Looks like he increased some of the scalation on the face, which I really like, because I think Venusaur's model has a little bit of like the different colored little splotches on the face, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I really like the vines you know, they look basically what I figured the vines would look like. I don't really, not a ton else to say about the vines. But it looks also like notably less chunky. Like the face looks maybe a little chunkier. It looks like he sort of might have given it the Alolan Persian sort of syndrome. But the body itself looks slimmer than at least like the overworld 3D model in like Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee looked. But, and once again, off the ground makes it look just like a lot more active of an animal, as opposed to in the games how Venusaur looks like it just kind of sits there and doesn't do anything. So I really like this because it, like I said, it makes Venusaur look a lot more active, which I really like. Next up we have Psyduck, who looks almost exactly like it did, maybe a little slimmer, but looks almost exactly like it did in Detective Pikachu. And I know, you know, I looked up beforehand that this piece of art was released 3 years ago, so at least 2 years before Detective Pikachu came out. So I don't know, that's really interesting how similar it looks. But the first thing that I noticed is that the hairs on the top of Psyduck's head, I always assumed were just like, it makes way more sense that they're feathers, but even in Detective Pikachu, it just looked like a little thin black like stalk of hair. But obviously with it being a bird, you know, Psyduck, it makes so much more sense for it to be a feather. But I also don't think they have this part on the actual piece, like on Psyduck's model. But a lot of ducks do have that sort of transition zone between the beak and feathers, which I think is really neat. Once again, the background to this is absolutely beautiful. Like a waterfall in the background, as well as it looks like it's like a forest, like a brook in a forest or something, which obviously just looks super, super incredible. So as good as the Psyduck looks, though, Golduck looks way more interesting because it gives me some biology things to talk about. So I think this is probably one of my favorites, just because it makes me think about Golduck in a way that I never have before. In that thinking about it like an actual like bird, you know? Because every other time you see Golduck, it's standing upright, it's usually got its hands out like this, and it's standing like a person would, but just with a long tail and with a duck beak. That's basically it. But this makes me actually think of Golduck like an actual duck, particularly because of the hind leg here. So birds, interestingly, I've heard a lot of people joke that like birds have backward knees, like when I was a kid, but that's not actually the case. So birds do have knees. They don't have kneecaps. Fun fact, mammals are the only animals that have kneecaps. I learned that relatively recently. Anyway, but the knee of a duck is actually about here, roughly, based on what I know about anatomy and what I can tell about anatomy from, you know, this one piece of art on an organism that doesn't actually exist. But however, it to me looks like the femur is sort of right here, so that'd be the thigh bone, and then comes down the tibia and fibula, your shin bones, come down to here, and then this part right here, that is homologous, which means it's the same part that does a different thing, or two parts in different organisms that descended from the same part in like a common ancestor. But that is essentially the part from like the ball of your foot, like that like part with a lot of extra skin. Sorry, when I explain biological things, it helps for me to point it out on myself. So I'm pointing at my foot right now. But the part on your foot behind your big toe, that's like has a lot of, that's really thick skinned, from that part back to your heel, that is homologous to this, and that part is called the tarsometatarsus. And then, you know, this part here, its foot, is homologous to the toes, you know, as well as a little bit of the tarsals as well, or metatarsals. So they actually have like a whole different segment of their hind limbs. And we'll actually do Doduo next, because Doduo is you can point this out a lot easier on Doduo. But it just gets me to think about Golduck in a way that I never had before, and I really, really appreciate that. It also, doesn't change the fact that Golduck still has hands, so he doesn't just turn it pure bird. It still does have hands, like a human, because, like I said, Golduck is basically just an anthropomorphic duck. So massive shout out to also giving it very duck-like eyes. I've a relatively avid duck hunter, especially when I was younger. Me and my dad used to go a lot, and this face, especially the eyes, are very much duck. So I think he captured that very, very well. And so once again, massive shout outs to just making me think about a Pokemon that I've known for literally like 24 years. Golduck's been in my life for as long as I've been alive, but this is the first time I've ever thought about it this way. So massive props to the artist for sort of making me have those kinds of thoughts. Alright, so next, like I said, we have Dodo. I'm just gonna, before we talk about too much else, I'm going to sort of just reference the same parts that I was talking about on Golduck. This is one that I really wish there was a full 360 model of. There is, for some of these pieces of art, Joshua does have like a 3D video where he just, in his 3D modeling software, just records it spinning around 360 so you can get the full complete view of it, but this is not one of them. But anyway, so we can talk about some of the same parts. So right here, this entire thing is homologous to your foot, with, right here being about where your heel is, and then down here obviously being your toes. That being said, we have the, this part right here is homologous to your shin, with the, thigh being somewhere up in the body up here. And it's interesting. It looks like, despite Dodo obviously being relatively large, I don't know off the top of my head how big Dodo is, but it's at least, I want to say like 4 feet tall, probably. I'm actually going to look that up really quick. Yeah, so Dodo is 4'7", or I think it was like 1.4 meters. So obviously size-wise, it's much more comparable to some of the bigger ratites, which is the group of like large flightless birds that like ostriches, emus, and I think cassowaries are in that group as well. Size-wise, it's much more comparable to one of those, but like based on just the face and the beak, it looks to me a lot more like a kiwi bird, the little tiny guys from New Zealand. Mostly, let's see if I'll zoom in, yeah. Because of these little hairs, I don't know why, I'm almost positive that kiwi birds have those. Just the long, slender beak as well. Ostriches and emus tend to have a shorter, stouter beak. And then cassowaries, obviously, if you've never seen a cassowary, they are absolutely terrifying. But they have this big crest on the top of their head that they used to headbutt stuff with. Obviously, neither Doduo or Dodrio have that on them. So I think, it can pretty safely rule out that it's not based on a cassowary. Also, cassowaries are blue. Anyway, but to me, it looks a lot more like a kiwi bird than it does any of the other ratites, because kiwis are much more closely related to those types of birds, to my knowledge anyway, than to other like flighted birds. Unfortunately, Joshua does not have a piece of art of Dodrio up on the website that he publishes all of his art on. Hopefully he'll get to that eventually. But I really honestly just love the detail in that you can get this close and still see like some of the finer details in the feathers. I think that's really, really cool. And like I said at the beginning, I am definitely not an art person. I could never do anything like this, especially with 3D modeling. I've dabbled with 3D modeling a little bit, but I just don't have the time to dedicate to get this good at it. But anyway, that's enough of me rambling about how good Joshua is. Let's move on to the next one. So for the next one, I decided to do Dratini, and like Doduo, Dratini is the only one of its evolutionary line that Joshua has released art for. However, Joshua did also release 2 separate pieces of art for Dratini, so we'll go over both of them. But the reason I wanted to go over Dratini is because I want to go over another similarly structured Pokemon next, and point out some differences between the two. So something that I want you to take particular note of on Dratini is the scales and how relatively small they are. So Dratini obviously does have these larger scales called labial scales around the lips. Basically every reptile has those, just because that tends to be a spot that needs a little more protection. You know, it's where you eat, and obviously things tend to not like you eating them. So thicker, bigger scales just tend to offer more protection there. But also something that I want you to notice, like I said, is how small the individual scales on the face are, but also that Dratini has eyelids, which will become important for the next Pokemon that we take a look at. And then also something that I literally just now noticed is that it's spraying stuff out of its nose, like sort of like a dolphin or a whale would when it comes up for air. I think that's just a really neat, really interesting detail that he decided to add that I didn't notice until literally just now. Obviously the background looks incredible as well. It looks like it's in some kind of lake, maybe a river. I think just based on what I've seen from the other piece that we'll take a look at, it is a river. And I actually get to employ some of my geology knowledge to something Pokemon for once. That's my own problem. Anyway, let's go to the second one, where it's completely underwater with another Dratini in the background. And I like this one because it gives you a better look at the ventral scales. These are much more snake-like than the rest of the body, particularly the head. Because like I said, Dratini has eyelids, which snakes do not have. That is exclusively a lizard thing. And also some lizards do have bigger scales on their heads, but for most lizards, particularly legless lizards, which I think was one of the main inspirations for this piece of art for Dratini, they do have smaller individual scales on their head, as opposed to the bigger ones that you would see on a snake. But yeah, this just goes to show that you can tell the difference between a legless lizard and a snake pretty easily if you know what you're looking for. Even though snakes sort of are just highly advanced legless lizards, they're in the same group. But I just really like all the, more detail that you can see on Dratini in this, full body underwater shot. And the snout looks a little more pointy than sort of like the big round snout that you see in like all the classic art of Dratini, but like the one back here very much looks like that classic kind of round, very cute Dratini snout. And now if you'll indulge me, my geology knowledge. So the reason why I think this is a river is because of the size of these rocks. So lakes tend to be where smaller sediment settles. If you've ever been to like a beach on a lake, for the most part, it's all sand, but in rivers have the momentum in the water to pick up and move bigger pieces of rocks and gravel like this, whereas lakes just kind of don't. But yeah, geology knowledge. So next up we have, I believe, the only snake in the Gen 1 Pokedex, which is Ekans and Arbok, obviously. So I couldn't not do Ekans. Ekans is kind of a meme on my channel. If this is the first video of mine that you're watching, I did a Let's Play of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX, and the way the 3D model for Ekans moved really weirded me out. And that just kind of became a meme for the channel and for the rest of that series. But anyway, Ekans. So as you can see, Ekans does not have an eyelid. The way snakes work is that they actually have a scale over their eye that is transparent, which is why when a snake sheds, you can see where their eye was because there's a scale there. Which is why they never have to blink and why they don't have to, like some geckos do, like lick their eyeball. Snakes don't have to do that. So that's one very easy way you can tell a snake from a legless lizard. Also, the just generally larger scales on the head, it still has labial scales, the ones like right along the lips that are pretty big, but on the rest of the head, they're pretty noticeably bigger than the ones that Dratini had. I also really like the fangs that he chose to give it. So, because it's a rattlesnake, and he did put in the rattle as well, because it's a rattlesnake, that means that Ekans is based on a viper. So there's different kinds of venomous snakes, but vipers generally, actually not generally, all vipers have the biggest fangs of all venomous snakes, and they're so big that they actually have to like be hinged. So when their mouth is closed, or even when their mouth's open and they're not using the big fangs, as you can see, like the two big fangs are in the middle, and then it's got lots of other teeth sort of on the outside of the mouth. But it's got two bigger fangs in the middle that are hinged, and they can move in or out when they're not using them. So I thought that was really, a good, adequate biological thing to include in this piece of art, because with other types of venomous snakes like cobras, their fangs are much smaller proportionally, but vipers are known for having those two big fangs in the front that are not even like paired, but they can move each of them individually, almost like a spider can move their fangs individually as well. But just like I said, a very cool thing to include in this to teach people about biology. So next, naturally, we have Arbok. Arbok will get in nice and close, has proportionally much smaller fangs than Ekans did, just compared to like the size of the head, and also has the characteristic large head scales of a cobra. If we'll go back to Ekans really quick, it has many more scales than Arbok appears to have, and honestly, this whole picture looks like he just sort of photoshopped on Ekans' hood pattern onto like an actual cobra, which again is just a huge credit to how talented of an artist Joshua is. But I'm not super familiar. At one point in time, I took a class where I had to learn the names of all of like the scales on a snake's head, and for the most part they're pretty easy. It's mostly just based on what bone in the skull they're on top of, or would be on top of. Snake skulls are weird, but I'm not super familiar with like all the scalation patterns on like the hood of a cobra. I don't know that I've ever seen a cobra hooded up in person before. Not that I really want to. But as far as I know, that looks fairly accurate. But this is actually one of the few that he included different angles for. Let's take a look at some of the other angles of Arbok. Let's look at a side one first. So one thing that I really liked was that if you look at a like normal, like I think if you look at the official art of Arbok, the original like official art, it looked like its body was like segmented, almost like a worm would be, or almost like an arthropod would be. But in this, he decided to take each of those segments, and instead of like making them literal segments, he just put bands across Arbok, and you can see them on the front as well. There's one like right here, and I thought that was like a really interesting design choice that I probably wouldn't have thought of if I were doing this. I probably would have just ignored them personally, but I really enjoy it, and it also makes Arbok look much more proportionally correct, because Arbok I think is only like 11 feet long, maybe like 11 and some change. It's definitely not 12 feet long, but which is actually sort of on the shorter side for a king cobra. That's like a medium length for a king cobra. However, Arbok weighs way more than a king cobra would, and which makes sense. It's a lot thicker, and a lot, especially with the hood much larger than a king cobra is. And you can see it a lot better from this angle, that it makes it actually look the length that it is. And it makes it look like an actual snake, unlike Arbok, which kind of, to me, just looks like a big worm because of how sort of chunky it looks. It doesn't look proportionally like a snake. And Joshua does an excellent job of changing that for his art. Alright, so we'll do, I think, this evolutionary line, and then one that I wanted to end on because it also, similar to Golduck, had me just view this one particular Pokemon in a really different way. But we'll get to that one after this line. So here we have the Slowpoke line, and I love it. It looks so cute, and like it's got lots of moss or algae growing on its back. It looks sort of like a hybrid between the face, to me, especially with all the bristles on the snout. The snout especially looks very much like manatee or dugong-esque, but like the rest of the body, and I mean dugong the animal, not dugong the Pokemon, but the rest of the body looks very much like hippo to me. That's a lot of what that reminds me of, and I think it's really interesting. You can get a better look at it because he actually includes 2 pieces of art for Slowpoke as well. But how he includes like a toe, also on the front limb as well. I didn't catch that until just now. But a toe without a claw on it, because I think each of Slowpoke's feet only have 1 claw on it, but he gives it some toes without claws, which I think was an interesting design choice. Let's see, like all the cracks in the skin, that also, like, you know, pretty heavily strikes me as like a hippo, because hippos can sometimes have that. Let's see, let's take a look at this other one, this other image of Slowpoke, where once again he's got some, you know, it coming up to breathe, like we saw with Dratini, which is kind of blowing some water out of its nose. You can see this right here is also what made me think of this as a hippo, because that's very much how hippos move underwater. Hippos don't actually swim. They're so heavy and dense that they just sink and then just run on the bottom of rivers. So that right there is sort of what made me also think of hippo. And you can see right here, it looks like he gives Slowpoke 3 toes on each foot. So we have the main one with the claw, and then 1 on each side that doesn't have a claw. It looks, it's tough to see with the watermark on here, but obviously I understand why Joshua puts the watermark on it. It looks like each of its feet has 3 toes, but only one of those toes has a claw. Which is actually interesting, because hippos, to my knowledge, have 4 toes. So I'm curious why he only gave them 3. I'm actually going to look that up. Okay, can confirm. Hippos do have 4 toes. And, like, I knew that they're part of the, like, familial group of animals that have an even number of toes, but that goes by, like, ancestry and not necessarily by how many actual toes they have. For instance, like, oh, actually, I'll talk about that part in the next Pokemon that we're looking at after Slowbro. But yeah, so keep in mind the number of toes conversation, because I might not remember. Anyway, moving on to Slowbro. The first thing I noticed was how terrifying this supposed to be Shelter looks. This could be like an evil thing in Courage the Cowardly Dog. So he doesn't have Slowbro or Slow King, piece of art for Slow King. I can't wait to see that when that happens, because that's going to be even more terrifying, I think. Yeah, honestly, that just is absolute nightmare fuel. So if you're watching this at night, I'm sorry. Anyway, going back to the actual Pokemon itself. Once again, the snout very much reminds me of a manatee, where the rest of the body just looks very like chunky, hippo-ish. And similarly to, he actually gives Slowbro claws on all 3 of its fingers, which I do believe it has in its official art, but once again only gives it claws on... Actually, he appears to give it 4 toes on the hind limbs, which is interesting. So he's got 1 on the inside here and then 1 on the outside, but only puts claws on the 2 middle ones. And I know Slowbro does only have 2 claws on its feet in its official art, but he gave it 4 toes here, which is, you know, like I said, correct for a hippo. But skin is very wrinkly and still has a lot of the algae and moss growth on it, like we saw on Slowpoke, because it's just such a slow-moving animal. And also just look how cute that face is. I want to get this cloister out of my sight because it's terrifying. But like, just look how cute that face is. It just looks so, like, blissfully unaware of everything that's happening in 2020. If only I could be too. And lastly, at least for this video, we have a Pokemon that has creeped me out for my entire life. Drowsy. So, Drowsy, in the games, It's it's Pokedex entry. One of the creepiest Pokemon that there is. Probably one of the only creepier Pokemon is Hypno, which, fortunately for now, Joshua does not have a piece of art out for it yet. I can only imagine how creepy he can make that, because in the next of these videos, I'll make sure to do Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar, because they are genuinely terrifying. But I want to talk about Drowsy, because Drowsy looks so cute. It just looks so relaxed. It doesn't look creepy at all. Maybe it's because it's not doing the weird little hand thing that it does in its 3D model, which made it way creepier. But going back to the toes thing, yes. So Drowsy is based on a tapir, which is a member of the order Perissodactyla, which are the odd-toed ungulates. So it's basically horses, rhinos, and tapirs. So tapirs, being members of that group, have an odd number of toes. And I'm going to double check this just to make sure that it's correct, but I believe they have different numbers of toes on their forelimbs compared to their hind limbs. I'm going to check that before I say incorrect things. So, interestingly, tapirs have 4 toes on their front limbs, or front feet, but 3 toes on their back. So they are members of that group because of their back feet. It's a weird technicality, but the fossil evidence also supports that. That they're more closely related to things like rhinos and horses than they are to things with an even number of toes, such as deer, hippos, cows, that kind of thing. But, so, like, I understand why he chose to only give it 2 toes, appearingly. Because obviously that's what all of Drowsy's art says. Same thing with its front limbs, its hands, I guess. How it has 3 fingers instead of the 4 fingers that a tapir would actually have. But I understand, because, like I said with like Bulbasaur, sometimes you can take creative liberties because it just makes more sense to. But when you're changing the number of toes things have, sometimes it just doesn't make sense. So I find it very interesting, just some of the creative liberties that artists take sometimes, then when they choose not to take them at other times. I'd love to have Joshua on for like an interview type thing, just to sort of pick his brain about what, why he decided to take some of those creative liberties, but not others. Anyway, back to Drowsy. It just looks so, like, it looks fluffy. It looks, I'm getting some like very like Winnie the Pooh vibes from it. Its eye is slightly creepy, but to me it just looks very like chill, very relaxed. It's actually like reminded me a lot of, so when I was down in Central America last March, definitely not this March, I didn't travel much this March, but last March 2019, I was able to go to Central America, and that's what this forest reminds me a lot of. Because this is almost exactly what the forest that we like kind of walked around in Central America looked like. With lots of trees that don't have low limbs at all, because it's very much like rainforest where all of the limbs of the trees are up in the canopy. Anyway, but we actually got to feed some tapirs at a zoo, at like a private nighttime guided tour of the zoo. And tapirs traditionally, mostly are nocturnal animals, so when we were at the zoo during the day, they weren't really out doing much. But at night we got to feed them, and it was such a cool experience. Anyway, it's way more cute than I ever thought possible for Drowsy. And I hope that he doesn't just go pure nightmare fuel for Hypno, but I also kind of want him to, if that makes sense. We'll see. I don't even know what, Pokemon he's currently working on. I know, and we'll get to those ones eventually too, but he's done 2... Everything he's done so far has been in the original Generation 1 Pokedex, with 2 exceptions. He's done 2, like, separately commissioned pieces of art of a Pokemon from Gen 3 and a Pokemon from Gen 6. Like I said, we'll get to those eventually, or you can just go check them out at Joshua's links down below. So, we're now here on Joshua's website, where he publishes all of his art. Please, the link will be down in the description as well. Please go check out all of the art that Joshua makes and go support him, because obviously he is an insanely talented human being, and way more talented at this than I could ever be with basically anything in my entire life. And I want to thank him personally for, allowing me, giving me permission to make this video and sharing some of my biological sort of insights with you guys, because obviously, just based on some of the design choices that Joshua made, he knows quite a bit about biology as well. I'm not really sure about his individual background. We'll get to more of these different Pokemon at some point, assuming that Joshua, enjoyed this video and, allows me to continue doing this, because obviously I don't want to do it without his permission. But anyway, thank you all very much for watching. One last time, make sure to go check out all of Joshua's links in the description below. They'll be the first links in the description. Let me know your thoughts on all of these pieces of art that we've seen so far. Let me know if you want to continue this, and also if you have any questions. Hopefully Joshua will see this video and potentially be in the comments. So if you have any questions for Joshua, please ask them down below, or just go ask him on Twitter. Once again, that link will be in the description. But also make sure to follow me on Twitter at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science. And as always, there's a time and place for everything.